For over a century, a single house in Indiana has refused to change hands, not because no one wanted it, but because selling it would have forced the truth into the open. In 1912, a family lived here, paid taxes here, and built their lives here. Then, without warning, they vanished. No funerals, no departures, no records. The house remained legally occupied by no one, and the land beneath it held secrets powerful enough to erase an entire bloodline and keep history silent ever since. In the early 1900s, land was more than property. It was identity, inheritance, and survival. Every acre was documented, every transfer recorded, every family accounted for. At least, that's how it was supposed to work. But every so often, history breaks its own rules. Paper trails vanish, names dissolve from records, and places meant to anchor generations become quiet contradictions. This story begins with a house that should have been sold, inherited, or abandoned long ago. Instead, it remained frozen in time, legally owned yet never claimed. The family tied to it disappeared without deaths, without departures, and without explanation. What followed was not an accident or a clerical error, but a pattern of silence carefully maintained for decades. Because sometimes the most disturbing chapters of American history aren't marked by violence you can see, but by records that were never meant to be found. In 1912, just beyond the outer edge of Marion County, Indiana, there was a stretch of land that locals rarely talked about, despite passing it almost every day. A narrow dirt road cut through fields of corn and tall grass, bending slightly as it approached a two-story timber farmhouse set back from the tree line. The house wasn't hidden, it simply wasn't acknowledged. Built sometime in the late 1800s, the structure reflected the modest confidence of the era. White clapboard siding, a pitched roof, a deep front porch supported by 4 squared columns. The windows were tall and evenly spaced, suggesting careful planning rather than haste. This was not a shack built in desperation. It was a home built with the expectation of permanence. The land around it stretched just over 40 acres, flat, fertile, and unusually rich for the region. A shallow creek bordered the eastern edge of the property, while a dense stand of sycamore and oak trees shielded the rear of the house from view. From a distance, everything appeared ordinary. From up close, something felt paused. Neighbors would later recall that the house aged differently from others nearby. Roof shingles curled but never collapsed. The porch sagged slightly yet never broke. Windows cracked but remained unboarded. Even in neglect, the structure resisted decay, as if abandonment had been anticipated rather than accidental. The front door stayed closed. Not sealed, not barricaded, just closed. The lock was intact long after similar homes had been stripped for parts or vandalized. Children were warned not to approach it, not because of any specific incident, but because it wasn't ours. In the years leading up to 1912, the house had been lived in fully and visibly. Smoke rose from the chimney in winter. Laundry hung from lines near the back fence. Footpaths formed naturally in the grass from repeated use. The property showed the quiet rhythms of family life. Then, sometime between late autumn and early winter, those rhythms stopped. What makes the location unsettling isn't isolation. Other farms stood within walking distance. A church sat less than 2 miles away. The town center could be reached by wagon in under an hour. This was not a place where people disappeared unnoticed. Yet after 1912, the land stopped behaving like an occupied space, but it was never treated as abandoned either. Crops were planted one more season, then left to rot in the fields. Fence repairs were half finished and never resumed. Tools were left in sheds as if the workday had simply ended and never restarted. At night, travelers reported an unusual quiet near the property. Not the peaceful silence of farmland, but something heavier. Insects were unheard. Birds avoided the trees near the house. Lantern light was occasionally seen through the windows years after the family was gone, but never long enough to confirm human presence. The house did not fall into disrepair the way abandoned homes usually do. No squatters claimed it, no new owners renovated it, no bank seized it. It existed in a strange legal and physical limbo, maintained just enough to remain standing, neglected just enough to remain uninviting. The cellar beneath the house was unusually deep for a farmhouse of its size. Locals said it had been reinforced with stone rather than wood, an expensive choice for a family of modest means. There was no clear explanation for why such effort had been taken, especially since no records mentioned structural modifications. Behind the house, the land sloped gently downward before leveling out again near the tree line. Even decades later, that ground looked different: darker soil, uneven patches, grass that grew thicker there than anywhere else on the property. Farmers passing by would comment on it, then quickly change the subject. By the time newer roads were paved and automobiles replaced wagons, the house had become an anomaly. Maps still marked it, tax rolls still listed it, but no one claimed it, and no one questioned why. Places like this don't demand attention, they wait. They sit quietly at the edge of memory, letting time smooth over their sharpest edges. And in doing so, they become more dangerous, not because of what they reveal, but because of what they conceal. This was not just a house. It was a pause in history. If the house raised unease, the paperwork surrounding it raised alarms. In early 20th century America, land ownership was one of the most carefully documented aspects of daily life. Deeds, tax assessments, census rolls, church ledgers, and probate filings formed an interlocking system designed to ensure that no property and no family simply vanished. For something to disappear, many people had to agree not to notice. The earliest records connected to the farmhouse are unremarkable. In 1898, the Hollis family legally purchased the 40-acre parcel from a neighboring landholder. The deed was properly witnessed, stamped, and archived. Subsequent documents track annual tax payments, minor boundary adjustments, and even a small loan taken out against the property to repair the roof after a storm in 1906. Everything about the paper trail suggests stability. Then comes 1912. The final routine entry appears in October of that year, a tax receipt, signed and filed on time. After that, the records don't end, they fracture. There is no sale, no foreclosure, no transfer to a relative, no probate filing. Instead, the same owner name continues to appear year after year, as if the family never left, despite the complete absence of census data, voter registrations, or church attendance tied to them. It's a contradiction that should not be possible. The 1910 federal census lists the Hollis household clearly: 5 occupants, all accounted for, all residing at the farmhouse. The 1920 census, however, shows the property still existing, but lists it as occupied, status unclear. No names, no ages, no explanation. That notation appears nowhere else in the county. Tax records deepen the mystery. The property continues to be assessed, but the valuation remains artificially low, inconsistent with surrounding land. More strangely, the taxes are marked as paid, though the payer is never identified. No signature, no receipt number, just a check mark and a clerk's initials. Internal county memos from the period, later uncovered through archival research, show quiet confusion. Clerks flagged the file multiple times between 1913 and 1917, noting missing documentation and requesting clarification. Each request is stamped "Resolved" with no accompanying explanation. Probate court records are equally troubling. If the Hollis family had died, even suddenly, estates would have been processed. If they had left the state, deeds would have been transferred or abandoned. But there is no death record, no inheritance dispute, no outstanding mortgage claim. The family simply exits the system. Even the church records fall silent. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, events that normally anchor families to community history, stop without comment. The final church ledger entry lists the family attending service in late 1912. The following week, the line is blank. The most unsettling detail appears decades later when historians cross-referenced land registry books from neighboring counties. Several properties near the farmhouse changed ownership rapidly between 1913 and 1916, often purchased through intermediaries and resold at a profit. Beneath many of those parcels lay the same geological feature, a shallow coal seam. Yet no mining claim, no sale to an energy company, no lease agreement. On paper, nothing happened. In reality, the land became quietly untouchable, left in bureaucratic suspension, as if disturbing it would trigger questions no one wanted to answer. When the county transitioned to newer record-keeping systems in the 1930s, many older files were re-entered manually. Most inconsistencies were corrected. This one wasn't. The anomaly was preserved. By the time modern digitization began, the farmhouse had become a historical ghost, present in every database, explained by none. Because records aren't just documentation, they're agreements. And somewhere in 1912, an agreement was made that the truth tied to that house would never be written down. Before they became an absence, the Hollis family were simply part of the landscape, ordinary, consistent, and known. In small farming communities, people did not disappear easily. Lives were intertwined through labor, worship, and routine. Everyone knew who lived where and for how long. The Hollises were no exception. The head of the household, Samuel Hollis, was in his early 40s by 1912. County records describe him as a tenant-turned-owner, a man who worked his way into land ownership through persistence rather than inheritance. He was not wealthy, but he was respected. He repaired his own fences, rotated his crops carefully, and rarely missed a tax deadline. Neighbors remembered him as quiet, observant, and deliberate, someone who spoke only when necessary. His wife, Margaret Hollis, kept the home and handled most interactions with the church and local school. She was known for her careful handwriting, which appears repeatedly in church donation logs and school correspondence. She organized seasonal gatherings, baked for funerals, and ensured the children were presentable and punctual. If Samuel represented stability, Margaret represented continuity. Their 3 children, 2 boys and a younger daughter, were all under the age of 15 in 1912. School attendance records show steady enrollment. Teachers described the children as attentive, well-behaved, and unremarkable in the way that suggested a stable home. There were no disciplinary notes, no absences beyond illness, no warning signs. Photographs from church picnics show the family standing together, slightly apart from others, but clearly included. They dressed plainly but neatly. Their expressions are calm, untroubled. Nothing in those images hints at crisis, conflict, or imminent departure. In the months leading up to their disappearance, the paper trail shows no distress, no deaths called in, no legal disputes, no reported illnesses. The family did not sell livestock. They did not advertise tools or equipment. There was no preparation for relocation. Neighbors later struggled to pinpoint the exact moment something changed. Some recall seeing smoke from the chimney into early November. Others claimed the house went dark earlier than that. The last confirmed sighting of the family comes from a church service in late autumn of 1912. They were present, they were accounted for, and then they were gone. What's most unsettling is how complete the disappearance was. The children never enrolled in another school. The parents never appeared in another census. No distant relatives came looking. Even extended family names vanish from nearby records in the following years, as if association itself had become a liability. The farmhouse interior, as later described by officials, suggested interruption rather than departure. Furniture remained, clothing hung in closets, kitchenware sat on shelves. A calendar on the wall had not been turned past the week they vanished. There was no packing, no damage, no sign of struggle officially recorded. Yet, unofficial accounts tell a different story. One neighbor claimed hearing raised voices late one night, followed by the sound of a wagon moving without lights. Another recalled dogs barking uncontrollably for hours near the property, then falling silent all at once. These statements were never written down at the time. They surfaced decades later, offered hesitantly, often after long pauses. The sheriff who responded to the initial concerns filed no missing persons report. Instead, he logged the property as temporarily unoccupied. That designation was never changed. The family's name slowly faded from conversation. Speaking it became uncomfortable. In a community built on shared memory, the Hollises became something unspoken, not because they were forgotten, but because remembering them raised questions no one could answer safely. They didn't leave behind a mystery that demanded attention. They left behind a silence that enforced it. And in that silence, 5 lives were erased, not by time, but by decision. Silence does not arrive all at once. It settles in layers, slowly replacing sound, memory, and eventually truth. After the Hollis family vanished, the first thing the community noticed was not their absence, but the quiet agreement not to talk about it. At first, people assumed the family had gone away temporarily. That was how disappearances were explained when no explanation was given. Farms were demanding. Illness happened. Travel took time. Weeks passed, then months. The house remained dark. Still, no one asked too loudly. When winter tightened its grip on the county, the farmhouse stayed unlit. No smoke rose from the chimney. Snow gathered on the porch steps and went undisturbed. Yet the property was never declared abandoned. The gate stayed latched. The fence repairs begun in autumn were left exactly as they were, unfinished but not dismantled. This is when the stories begin. A few neighbors later admitted they heard movement at night. Wheels on dirt roads after midnight, horses led without lanterns, voices kept low and urgent. One farmer claimed he saw figures behind the Hollis house during a snowfall, digging where the earth should have been frozen solid. When he mentioned it to another man the next morning, the response was immediate and firm: forget it. Children sensed the shift even before adults acknowledged it. They were warned not to play near the property, not because it was dangerous, but because it was not for them. That phrasing stuck. Not unsafe, not cursed, just not for discussion. The church offered no answers. The Hollis pew remained empty, then was quietly reassigned without comment. No prayer requests were read, no announcements made. When Margaret Hollis's name was mentioned during a charity ledger review months later, the pastor closed the book and moved on. The sheriff's office became the center of the silence. Officially, there was no case, no missing persons report, no follow-up. The initial welfare check was logged, minimal and final. When questioned years later, deputies claimed there had been no cause for concern. The family had likely moved on. Yet the sheriff himself changed after that winter. He stopped attending certain gatherings. He sold his home earlier than planned and relocated to a neighboring county. He never spoke publicly about the Hollis property again. What's striking isn't that people were afraid, it's that they learned when fear was unnecessary. Silence, in this case, wasn't enforced through threats, it was enforced through consequence. Those who asked questions found doors closing, business drying up, invitations quietly withdrawn. By the time spring arrived, the land around the farmhouse behaved strangely. Crops planted nearby failed, livestock avoided the tree line behind the house, dogs refused to enter the property. These details were noted, then dismissed, then forgotten. Except they weren't forgotten by everyone. One elderly resident later described the silence as organized, not by law, not by violence, but by understanding. Everyone seemed to know the same thing without ever hearing it spoken. Whatever happened at that house was not meant to be unearthed. Years passed, roads improved, new families moved into the area. The farmhouse became a landmark without a story, referenced only by location, past the old place, near that house. And yet, even newcomers learned quickly not to ask. When government workers came through decades later to reassess land values, they avoided lingering near the property. When surveyors marked boundaries, they worked quickly and left. When county officials reviewed archival inconsistencies, they stamped files closed and moved on. Silence, when sustained long enough, becomes tradition. The Hollis family did not fade from memory because people forgot them. They faded because remembering required confrontation with power, with profit, and with guilt. Silence became a shield, protecting not just those responsible, but those who chose not to know. And the house stood at the center of it all, quiet, intact, and legally occupied by a lie that everyone agreed to maintain. Because once a community accepts silence, breaking it becomes the greatest crime of all. For more than 60 years, the house remained untouched by investigation, protected not by fences or warnings, but by habit. Then, in 1974, progress arrived in the form of county infrastructure. Drainage improvements were scheduled across several rural properties, including the land behind the old Hollis farmhouse. It was the first time in generations that anyone had official permission to disturb the ground. The workers were not historians, they were not investigators. They were there to dig trenches, lay pipe, and leave. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The soil was dense but workable. Roots were thick near the tree line, just as expected. Then one of the shovels struck something solid, metal, not stone. Buried beneath the rear edge of the cellar foundation was a small iron lockbox, heavily corroded but intact. Its placement was deliberate, positioned just deep enough to avoid accidental discovery, yet close enough to the structure to suggest urgency rather than long-term planning. When the box was pried open, it did not contain money. It contained fragments. Inside was a single child's leather shoe, badly worn, sized for a child no older than 8. There were folded receipts dated between 1910 and 1911 bearing Samuel Hollis's name and signature. And at the bottom lay a hand-drawn land survey, marked with red ink in irregular lines that did not correspond to property boundaries. One worker described the smell as wrong, not rot, not rust, but something metallic and stale, as if the box had been sealed in haste. The items were immediately turned over to county officials who logged the discovery as miscellaneous historical debris. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the items quietly disappeared. The lockbox was entered into an evidence ledger, then removed. The shoe was never cataloged into any museum or archive. The receipts were photographed once, poorly, then misplaced. The survey map was labeled illegible and returned to storage, where it was never seen again. What remained were copies, incomplete, grainy, just enough to raise questions. The shoe did not match any known burial record. The Hollis children were never listed as deceased. The receipts confirmed the family's presence on the land after their supposed relocation date. And the red markings on the survey map, according to later experts who saw the photograph, aligned disturbingly well with the darker soil patches behind the house. County officials concluded there was no actionable finding. No excavation followed. No forensic review was ordered. The trench work resumed, carefully avoiding the area where the box had been found. But word spread anyway. Locals whispered that the ground had finally given something back, that the house had been hiding more than records. Older residents, long silent, began to connect pieces they had buried in their own memories: the digging sounds, the wagons, the sheriff's visit.
A retired county clerk later admitted that the discovery caused panic inside local government offices. Files were pulled, reviewed, then returned with fresh stamps marking them closed. One memo warned against reopening historical matters without jurisdictional cause. The discovery did not trigger investigation, it triggered containment. In the weeks that followed, access to the property was restricted. No official explanation was given. The farmhouse was suddenly listed as structurally unsafe, though no inspection report was released. Drainage plans were revised. The land behind the cellar was left untouched. For the first time since 1912, something had broken the silence, and the response was immediate. Because the lockbox proved one thing beyond doubt: the Hollis family had not simply vanished. They had left something behind. Something they wanted found, or something they never had time to hide properly. And whatever truth lay beneath that house, it was close enough to the surface that even decades of silence could not keep it buried forever.
By the time the 1974 lockbox was discovered, the Hollis house had already existed as a paradox for more than 60 years. On the surface, it appeared abandoned, yet legally it was occupied. On paper, the family had vanished, yet property records kept their name alive. The lockbox shattered what little ambiguity remained, hinting at a truth long suppressed. But what followed the discovery was not investigation. It was a meticulous cover-up, orchestrated to ensure that the past remained unchallenged. Inside county offices, the photographs of the shoe, receipts, and survey map caused concern. Officials realized that the items suggested more than neglect. They suggested criminal intent. The red ink on the survey map, when examined by one retired historian decades later, seemed to correspond to specific points behind the house, precisely where disturbed earth had been noted in eyewitness accounts. In other words, something significant had been buried there. Yet, the county's response was strikingly deliberate. The lockbox itself disappeared into archival storage, never to be cataloged publicly. Copies of the photographs were marked confidential. County memos referred vaguely to historical property artifacts and advised that no action be taken without higher approval. In essence, the discovery was quietly neutralized. The rationale was simple. Acknowledging the contents would raise questions that could not be answered. If the items were linked to the Hollis family's disappearance, officials would have to admit that records were falsified or incomplete, and that years of oversight had ignored or even facilitated a deliberate erasure. It would implicate not just bureaucrats, but influential figures from the community, including landowners, local judges, and possibly law enforcement officers who had been involved in the family's disappearance in 1912. Even local media coverage was curtailed. Newspapers that normally ran human interest stories or historical features received inquiries from county officials. One editor later claimed that reporters were subtly warned to leave the matter be, and that any attempt to dig further would cause unnecessary disruption. As a result, what could have been a sensational revelation, a family erased, a house hiding its secrets, was never broadcast, never examined, and never understood by the public. There were also financial incentives to maintain the silence. The land beneath the Hollis property sat atop a pole seam that, once identified, was extremely valuable. Leasing or selling the property would have required clarifying ownership, revealing inconsistencies in the records, and exposing decades of inaction, or worse, deliberate omission. By keeping the house legally untouched, the county and those with vested interests in the coal avoided scrutiny, potential lawsuits, and unwanted attention. Eyewitnesses who had come forward after the discovery faced subtle pressure. Some were offered compensation for their silence, others quietly removed from local committees or civic positions.
Historians who sought access to archives were denied permissions, and any documents that might have corroborated the unusual soil disturbances or the red ink survey were classified or misplaced. The story was contained, quietly, with precision. The cover-up was reinforced over decades through repetition and omission. Successive generations of officials inherited the files, read the memos, saw the photographs, and understood the implied instructions. Do not investigate, do not question, do not speak. By the 1980s, the Hollis property had become a cautionary tale in silence rather than a subject of inquiry. The house itself remained intact, but its history became a shadow, visible only to those who knew to look and willing to notice anomalies others ignored. What the lockbox revealed, whether accidental or intentional, was enough to suggest a crime had occurred, or at least a deliberate erasure of lives. The unnatural state of the records, the absence of burial or relocation filings, and the correspondence between the red ink map and the disturbed soil all pointed toward a truth that local authorities, for reasons both practical and personal, refused to confront. In essence, the cover-up was not just about hiding facts, it was about controlling history. The county made sure that no one could reconstruct what really happened, no one could identify where the family might be buried, and no one could challenge the official version of events. Silence became the official narrative. Even today, the Hollis house stands as a monument to that cover-up, legally owned, never sold, occupied in the eyes of bureaucracy, but empty in reality. Its foundation hides a secret that the world was never meant to uncover, protected by paperwork, power, and decades of quiet compliance. The truth, though, has a way of pressing against time, and while the house remains and the cover-up remains, the lockbox proved something undeniable. History can be rewritten, but it cannot be entirely erased.
Some stories linger not because they are told, but because they resist being forgotten. The Hollis family, erased from records and memory, exists today only in fragments. A rusted shoe, a faded survey map, whispers from neighbors long gone, and the house itself standing stubbornly at the edge of time. It is tempting to search for closure, to demand justice, or to imagine the truth in concrete terms, but history does not always yield answers. Sometimes the most disturbing chapters of our past are written not with violence we can see, but with silence we are forced to interpret. The house, its foundation, walls, and soil remains a silent witness. It reminds us that absence is not always empty, and that what is buried may be too dangerous, too inconvenient, or too inconveniently true to ever be unearthed fully. To understand the Hollis disappearance is to understand the limits of official history. Names can be erased, lives can be rewritten, paperwork can lie, but memory, however fractured, always finds a way to press against the silence. The story leaves us unsettled, not because it ends badly, but because it does not end at all. And perhaps that is exactly what the house was designed to do, to exist beyond time, beyond accountability, and beyond the reach of those who would attempt to rewrite the past. Some histories aren't lost, they're hidden, and some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. If stories like this intrigue you, stories of forgotten families, hidden crimes, and histories erased from the record, you're in the right place. Here, we don't just recount history, we dig beneath it. We uncover the truths that others tried to hide. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join us as we continue exploring America's buried nightmares. Because the past always leaves clues, and some stories are too important to ignore.